Hi, thank you for allowing us to wait for a couple of minutes so everybody could trickle down. Welcome, my name is Canan Hillmer, and I am the director of the Global Women's Leadership Program at the Business School, formerly known as CAS. First of all, from the bottom of my heart, thank you all for joining us. It's been a very long year. Most of us are sick of being on another online event, and we have been very excited to see the interest in this specific event. The goal of our program is to promote and support gender equity, both within the school and outside. To this end, we coordinate scholarships for bright, high-potential women to study at CAS. We organize events with inspiring speakers to equip and empower women for leadership, just like our event this evening. We connect women by nurturing networks for their success. And last but not least, we disseminate research by our academics on gender-balanced leadership. You can find more information about the program on our website. And if you missed some of our recent events, such as the one called The Power of Privilege, where we actually asked mostly middle-class white women to help other women along, or our event entitled Overcoming Job Challenges and Achieving Professional Growth During the COVID-19 Pandemic, their recordings are on the website too, so feel free to visit and take a look. Over the years, we have run several events with inspiring leaders, both male and female, on how they lead and promote gender equity in organizations. We delivered panel discussions on how women can prepare themselves for leadership roles, or how women can support each other in their professional roles. I am very pleased to say that this is our first event that focuses on one of our biggest allies, you men. Men hold most of the positions in top leadership and on boards for most organizations. Their clear and direct support is undeniably one of the biggest building blocks in achieving gender equity. We have three wonderful panelists who all have considerable expertise and experience on this topic. Pavita Cooper is Deputy Chair of the 30% Club. She is also founder of talent and career insight business More Difference. She's a commissioner to the board of the Equity and Human Rights Commission, the lead non-executive director to an agency of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, a trustee of the Chartered Management Institute, where she chairs Chartered Management Institute RACE. So as you can see, I got tired by just reading her accolades. And if you want to see more about her, we have more information on the registration page. Nikhil Rathi is an Executive Financial Conduct Authority Board member and was appointed Chief Executive of the FCA on the 1st of October 2020. Nikhil was previously Chief Executive of London Stock Exchange PLC and Director of International Development. Before joining the LSE in 2014, Nikhil served in the HM Treasury, latterly as Director of Financial Services. And then we have finally David Smith, who is joining us from the United States today. David Smith, PhD, is co-author of the book Good Guys, How Men Can Be Better Allies for Women in the Workplace, and an associate professor of sociology in the College of Leadership and Ethics at the US Naval War College. He focuses his research in gender, work, and family issues, including gender bias in performance evaluations, dual career families, military families, women in the military, and retention of women. He's the co-author of Athena Rising, How and Men How and Why Men Should Mentor Women, and other numerous journal articles and book chapters. So, before we begin, a brief point of housekeeping. This event is recorded except for the Q&A session, which will be held at the end of the panel discussion. If you have any questions, please do start submitting your questions. You should see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to tweet, do add in our handle at CASBusiness and our hashtag GWLP, which stands for the Global Women's Leadership Program. Thank you very much. And without further ado, let's start our discussion. So my first question is about why we care about gender equity in organizations, particularly at leadership levels. What are the benefits? What are the benefits to the organization, to the economy, to the society? And equally, what are we losing if we don't have gender equity in organizations? Nikhil, can I start with you? Hi.
Hi. Well, thank you very much for the invitation and for taking the initiative in organising this really excellent event. Delighted to be here. If I kick off in answer to your question, I'd say that well, there's a straightforward fairness issue. If we have half of our society not getting access to opportunities at the leadership levels of organizations, to my mind, there's a straightforward issue of fairness there. Secondly, and I now talk about this a little bit from a regulatory perspective, we're seeing increasing research and academic evidence which is pointing to the importance of diversity of thought and diversity of teams in ensuring a really good culture in major financial services institutions, in encouraging good conduct and strong risk management. There's been studies often cited from McKinsey, and it is of concern to us as the regulator that when we look at the senior management approvals in the UK financial services system, only 17% are women, 17%. That's telling us that there's something quite fundamental that needs to be shifted there. I'd also think about firms and their customers. Are you really going to be able to understand your customer base fully if you don't have teams in your organization that cannot bring a range of different perspectives to bear? Are you going to be able to design products in the right way, market them effectively? So I think there's a straightforward bottom line profit question as well for firms to consider too. Finally, if I talk about the entrepreneurs and the ability to raise capital and businesses to grow and create jobs, Alison Rose, who's currently the chief executive of NatWest Group, did a review on female entrepreneurship, and there were some startling statistics in there. She identified that only 1% of venture capital funding goes to female-led businesses. And again, what is that telling us about the way in which those decisions are made? And are we really saying that that those businesses are not as capable of growing and scaling and being successful in creating jobs as those businesses that are male-led? So the cost, I'd say, is the cost in terms of jobs as well as the fairness point too. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think you made some really good points about fairness, about decision making and entrepreneurship. And a couple of years ago, we ran an event, actually a series of events with our colleagues from Center for Entrepreneurship in the business school, and I was rather surprised by how there are some unique aspects to the pitching process, to the funding process with respect to women. And I learned from my colleagues a lot. Now, Pavita, you, of course, have a lot of experience yourself through your company, but you also have a lot of indirect experience through the several boards and organizations you sit on. So what would you add to what Nikhil said?
So I think Nikhil made some really important points about looking at sort of equity, not just across organizations, but more broadly in society. I think one of the things that I'm really focused on is we often do see actually a more even split around gender at the entry level of many organizations, and particularly at graduate level. Often you've got young women graduating with better degrees and more of them entering the workplace. The problem is the drop off the cliff happens quite early on. So it doesn't matter what sector you look at, whether you look at healthcare or you look at banking or you look at the legal profession or the big professional services organizations. When you look at the top, whether you look at gender or the issue of race, you just don't see equal representation. So there's an issue at which the rate at women are accelerating through organizations. And even for the first time this year, we had across all FTSE 350 organizations, no boards with all male boards on. We still had 17 executive committees that had all male teams. And we still retain organizations that have this notion of one and done. They have one woman on the board and they think they're done. And when that rolls off, a man replaces them. So we don't have it actually hardwired into our psyche in the way we think about this. And I think there are two crisis points in the last 10 years. One was the financial crisis, and now through the pandemic, we can see that those organizations that have better representation in terms of gender have what we call a better pandemic. Their response, their focus on culture and people has been better. They've retained higher levels of engagement in a very difficult time. So I think it's not just about ensuring we get equal numbers in, it's about we sustain those numbers as people move through the organization.
So you're essentially saying what we're seeing through the experiences, particularly this last year. This last year has been a good confirmation that having diversity, especially at the top, really does help organizations go through the difficult times that they experience.
And not just difficult times, but the way they make decisions.
Yes.
Not having women in the room impacts the quality of the decisions being made.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, both of you. Now, of course, I want to, as you said, there are a lot of different aspects we need to think about. Gender diversity helps with diversity in decision making. It seems to help with understanding your customer base better, because a good portion of them might be women. It helps with entrepreneurial activities. And actually, we are now even seeing some evidence that not having women in some conversations may create some significant challenges in the future. For example, there's a lot of talk about biases in AI and what the impact of that is going to be, from hiring practices to customer retention practices and so on and so forth. Now, in this event, we are really focusing on men particularly, and their role of promoting gender equity. So one of the first questions I would ask is, why are we particularly focusing on men? Why is it so critical to have men as part of this conversation? David, since you have written extensively on this, can I ask you about your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you pointed out very clearly in the beginning that the fact that men are, again, the majority in so many organizations as we think about the senior leader representation, certainly in the boardroom, so much more power and influence. And we think about stakeholders in particular, that if we're going to make change and create change in the workplace, we've got to involve men in getting there. And in fact, we find in the research too, the same thing, that organizations where more men are involved, or at least we see more men involved in creating equity, and this is, in particular focused on gender diversity and equity, that we see more progress towards reaching those initiatives, and people feel like there's more inclusion in their organization, which again, diversity is important, but diversity without inclusion and belonging doesn't produce the results we're looking for here. So there's a cultural component to this, and so men being involved, because they make up a large portion of the senior part of this, is a huge difference. Boston Consulting Group did a research study a few years ago where they asked this question, and they found that in companies where we saw men being engaged in doing the work around gender equity and diversity, 96% of them saw that they were actually achieving the goals around these initiatives. But where men were not involved, it was less than 30%. So we see that it makes a big difference when men are involved in doing this, and the research points that out too.
Thank you very much. And as a recent example, Nikhil, I want to ask about your experience, because when you took up your role last year, you brought in a top team of women from business and law enforcement to executive roles across the FCA. And I actually read afterwards that you said, well, you still didn't think it was quite enough. So what drove your decision, first and foremost? And second, maybe more importantly, did you face any resistance, overt or covert?
When I took up the role as the CEO of the FCA, I was very clear that diversity and inclusion would be a priority for my tenure, and how we lead in terms of our engagement with the industry. And increasingly, I see it, for the reasons I explained earlier, a relevant regulatory issue as well. And we will be saying more about that with our colleagues at the Bank of England in the coming weeks. But we would expect to be using our powers progressively more in this area. But it's important to avoid a say-do gap as well. And we as regulators in the FCA, we have more work to do. I mean, they made a lot of progress over recent years, but we've signed up to the Women in Finance Charter and other ethnicity action plans as well. And we want to hit 50% of our senior leadership team as female by 2025. We were running a bit behind, and I had an opportunity as I was forming my leadership team to really focus on this. But what I would say is, in each case, we hired the best candidates in the competition. The instruction I gave to the recruitment firms that were working for us was I want you to go and search far and wide and hard and get me the best possible field and get the most diverse field. But as we evaluated the candidates coming through, in each case we hired the best person for the role, and I'm just really pleased that we were able to find such a talented group of colleagues willing to join the FCA. And if I talk to sort of Pavita's point earlier around the need for progression, numbers are good at the entry level, and then progression through the organisation. One of the things that I found really exciting about when we made those announcements was the inspiration it's given to young women in our organisation who've just joined, who can see when they see, now we have 6 out of 10 of our executive committee slots held by women. They can see that you can reach the top of an organisation, and it gives them a network, gives them some mentors, gives them some role models. And I think that's incredibly powerful. Did I receive resistance? Not hugely. I mean, I think there may have been the odd comment or two coming from certain directions, but I think not to any great extent. Interestingly, in some cases, women were commenting. Women were commenting about the appearance of colleagues that have been appointed as well. So it wasn't just necessarily men that were raising eyebrows at some of the appointments. Thanks.
And one thing we really haven't talked until yet, but it is quite an important part of the puzzle, is of course intersectionality. So among women, we know white women, middle-class white women, are more privileged. So we have to really consider, and I think particularly the Black Lives Matter movement last year has brought race a little bit more on the forefront, but there are other elements too. There is disabilities, there is your cultural reference point or the region, your nationality. So how important do you think these questions will come, or how seriously do we think about the different subgroups of women too in organizations? So do you have any thoughts about that, Nikhil?
I think it's a critical issue, and the pandemic has shown the significance of looking at the data here very carefully. In our Financial Lives survey, as we've looked at what has been quite a startling increase in vulnerability during the pandemic, some of the most severe impacts have been on women from ethnic minority groups who have the lowest job security, the most significant caring responsibilities, and often are operating at the lowest income levels as well, and their financial resilience has been impacted severely, as has mental health and well-being. And many of the traditional services which are used to support people in those kinds of situations, whether debt advice or other charity organizations, are not necessarily as accessible to some of those groups as you might think. So I think the point around intersectionality is absolutely critical. And we also need to think about it as we're thinking about colleagues who are progressing through our organization, just how it may feel for them to be, let's say, one minority ethnic woman in a group of 15 people, be they male or female, and the norms of behavior, the types of language that are used, what kind of impact that may have in terms of their ability to pursue their careers and develop. And I think that awareness and talking about those issues openly, I think can make a very significant difference.
And of course, Pavita mentioned the point that the discrepancy is not that wide at early entry level, but there's a significant cliff further down, and that is probably exasperated for some of those groups. For, when we look at women from different races or women with disabilities. Thank you very much. David, in your book, you talk about the fact that men consider themselves good. Most men consider themselves good and supportive of women empowerment, but that they are rather passive in that. What is the consequence of not really using your voice in this conversation?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, we, I don't know if it was Nikhil might have pointed that out earlier, this say-do gap. And we talk about it, is another way to think about it is most men believe in gender equity. And I would bet if we had a chance to poll the men on the call today, that most of the men here would say that they do. They believe in gender equity and equality. And I would also tell you that the research shows that most men believe that they're doing everything, they think they're doing everything they can to support and create equity in the workplace. The reality is that that's not the case, right? So this is we're not achieving the results. We're not actually accomplishing the actions that we think we are, right? Just because you believe it doesn't mean you're doing everything out there. And, we had a lot of this conversation that started last year around race as well, right? It's not enough just to say that again, that you believe in racial equality, and you actually have to work to dissemble and to tear down and create change, right? These are systemic inequalities out there. So we have to work the action and put ourselves out there to do that. And so the public piece of this is hard. And the reason it's hard is because in many cases, those of us in particular, people like me who are, white, middle-aged men who are in the majority in many cases, that we don't always have a good awareness of how people experience the workplace differently. And this could be about women or women of color, right, of different intersectional aspects of it as well. But understanding how people experience the workplace differently enables us to create change and to develop some of that empathy and understanding, but we don't always have that awareness. So the first part about being better allies, in particular in the workplace, and being better advocates, public advocates in the workplace, is really developing an awareness of how people experience the workplace differently. And so that's part of it. The other part that is so, I think, so important, and it came out very clearly in our work, was a lot of men, again, they believe in gender equity and equality, and maybe to some extent they have a pretty good understanding of and want to do the work around gender equity, but not sure where to start. Where do I begin? And there's a lot of fear, in particular coming out of the Me Too movement, concerns about making mistakes, of offending, of not sure what to do, of anxiety about putting myself out there, of feeling like I'm taking personal or professional risk in many ways. And then we heard this over and over again, that many people are just uncomfortable with it. And so how do you get people to engage in doing the work that makes them uncomfortable when they need to be uncomfortable doing that work? And that's not always an easy thing to do, but it is critically important to do, because if we're going to make change, we've got to do the public piece of this. It can't be just passive.
You bring up, well, two really good points, and I want to just ask, so you said creating awareness around it. What do you think is an effective way to create awareness around it? And perhaps what is an effective way? We will talk about what men can do further down in our conversation, but what is an effective way to create awareness about maybe how you start getting more involved in this?
Yeah, great question. And certainly we find that, no surprise that you should start first by self-educating. And this goes for any dimension of diversity that you're learning about. So read great books, attend panel sessions, events like today, right? And to begin to listen for and to read about and understand how other people experience the workplace a little bit differently than I do, and then seeing where do I find those, and then look into your own workplace and start to make the connections. Where do I see that? How do I see that apply in everyday practices or policies or processes that are going on in my own workplace? And then I think really important to this is eventually you've got to begin to have these conversations with your for the men out there, with your female colleagues. And these are not easy conversations to enter into. So you need to develop some very trusting relationships, close relationships with your female colleagues, be good friends with them. And when you enter into these conversations, be thoughtful about it. Have some humility in terms of, hey, I don't know what it's like, to be in your shoes, and I've got a lot to learn, and I've got a lot more questions, and I need to learn and understand, and so I've got to have I don't have all the answers here, so I need your help in understanding this, and making sure we approach with that humility, I think, is really important. A lot of the men that we talked to for the interviews for our book said that even having these close, trusting relationships still felt a little awkward, maybe, in jumping into that conversation about how do you ask somebody about how they experience the workplace or the challenges they experience in the workplace. And so some men said that they felt like they still needed to ask permission. Would it be okay if I ask you about your experiences here? And then to provide some context. I attended this event the other day. I'm trying to learn how to be a better ally and towards being more equitable in terms of gender and other dimensions of diversity. And would it be okay if I asked you about your experiences here at your organization? And gosh, if there was one thing I could do more of or less of this week, what would it be that would really help make a difference in your experience there? And the final part of this is, after you begin to have these conversations and you do start to engage in doing this work, the other important part of having really good, trusting, close female colleagues and kind of people that are inside your inner circle is they can act like your gender confidants. Men talked to us about how these women kind of had their backs, and they were also great mechanisms for feedback. And feedback is critical, because if I want to achieve the results, I need to have feedback on how well am I doing at this. So today, for example, if I said something and Pavita was my gender confidant, she might come to me and go, hey, David, today when you said that and all the women in the audience rolled their eyes, here's why. And I'd be like, oh my gosh, thank you. she had me there and gave me that feedback. But I think the other part of it is that we as men, and thinking about how we're going to be better allies and be more equitable in this way, we have to recognize that we're not perfect. And we're going to make mistakes along the way. And this is part of the risk, and the discomfort piece of this is we're on a journey. And as we begin to learn and develop awareness about this and put ourselves out there publicly and doing the work, you will inevitably make mistakes. And you have to be ready for the feedback and how to respond to show that you care about that.
Thank you very much. Our audience, of course, knows that we sent them a survey. after they registered to this event, and we asked one question: what do you think needs to be done for gender equity? And it's interesting because one of the main answers they provided, and we categorized all of the answers and we just dropped them in the chat function for anybody who's interested to see the overall results. But one of the big answers that we heard is you have to start hearing first, you have to listen, and you have to learn. So exactly what you were just saying. Now, to all of you, I have a question. Have you ever experienced somebody around you? It could be a colleague, or it could be a family friend, in a position of responsibility, getting stifled by somebody, a woman who got stifled by somebody that's in a position of responsibility. So have you met a woman who has felt that their progression had been really slowed down or blocked by somebody in power? And what happened at the end? What is the consequence of that, you think? I will just start with Nikhil.
Thank you. Well, I think I've seen things that are explicit and some that are less explicit. Increasingly these days, it's on the less explicit end of the spectrum. But I have seen situations where women of a certain age, potentially women who are pregnant, have found it very difficult to progress in their careers. And find when they apply for promotions or interview for particular roles, without any really satisfactory explanation, they were hitting a bit of a roadblock. In some of those situations, I think some of the women in question simply switched employer. I think now, and what we're seeing and is encouraging, is there is a much better understanding of some of those issues and a real focus on returner programs as well, particularly for colleagues who are returning from maternity leave. I think that's important. The less explicit examples are the culture, and I think the financial services sector is particularly problematic in this regard, but not only that sector. The culture of hiring people you know, or hiring people in your own image, a similar background. And I think I've seen countless cases of situations where essentially men are hiring men they've worked with previously. And when you've got an industry which is quite male heavy at the top, and you're just recruiting people from your previous employment into the new company you've worked for, that kind of consolidates the problem. And that's where the transparency around data, around pay gaps, the investor activism we've seen, the statutory disclosures that are necessary, and also now, as I talked about earlier, regulatory intervention. I think in those kinds of situations, some sharper tools are needed to get the momentum behind the change we all want to see.
That's a really good point, and it's really interesting because many companies have designed processes where they ask their employees to suggest potential new employees, and partially what you're saying is that might also bring some biases with it, because you are more likely to bring in somebody like you. Pavita, how about you? Have you experienced this around you? Have you heard of women who felt that their career progression had been blocked? And what is the consequence? What's the consequence to the organization? And what do these women decide to do?
So I call this the dripping tap. This is something that women experience every day. I probably hear from 10 to 20 women a week that I engage with, sometimes more. And it's not overt, as Nikhil says. I think 11 years ago when we started the 30% Club, when we used to get hate mail from chairmen, It was slightly more overt in those days. No, why are you doing this? And we don't need all these women at the top of organisations. I think most men have now come on board and understand the benefits. So it's subtle. And actually, to be fair, when I talk about leaders, I'm not talking about just men. I'm talking about men and women. So for women, often the impact of these everyday experiences is from a leader that could be a man or a woman. And to give you an example, I mean, often it's really subtle. So it's around key decisions, for example, like how work gets assigned. So assumptions about who should get key or critical work, which along later down the line impacts on someone's experience base and then therefore impacts on their ability to be considered for the next job. Women being guided into what we could perceive for the softer roles, so not into big commercial roles, but into marketing, PR, and HR. And I do a lot of speaking in schools, and it's amazing the amount of young women that say to me, I wanted to go and do science A-levels, and my teachers were guiding me towards the humanities, and we know that's not what they should be doing. So these are very subtle cues that people are being given all the time. And the big difference is I have sat through in my career hundreds and hundreds of succession discussions, and I do it now with boards. And it's really interesting how when leaders of both gender are talking about women, they will focus more heavily on attributes of that individual rather than the skills and capability. And the same happens around ethnic minorities. So it's not about, we've seen evidence of this individual doing this, that they talk about the person's attributes. And the way that plays out is if you then hear chairs and CEOs talk about candidates who are up for senior roles, and if it's a woman, they will often say, and in fact I heard someone say this last week, she hasn't done that job before, whereas they would feel much more comfortable being able to extrapolate the experience of a man and assume that he could do it in the future. Whereas the question they should be asking is, could she do it? Do I have enough data and evidence about this individual and their track record and everything else that tells me she could do the role? And by the way, the same applies for ethnic minorities. And part of the challenge is if you are from an environment where you haven't had the same exposure and access, i.e. a woman or an ethnic minority, you won't have had the same career path, you won't have had the same experience set. So if you've got someone in a key decision-making role, assuming that you have to have exactly the same skill set as a man and the same sort of experiences, you're going to fail at the outset. So I think it's really critical that people in key decision-making roles understand the myth of meritocracy, that if I put in place a great process and gold plate it and get the best search firms and throw lots of money at it, it won't necessarily give you the right outcome.
You brought up several good points. I mean, one of the, of course, things you said, how we focus, how we evaluate women for boards and how the conversation changes. And I think there's evidence about this for entrepreneurship too, that female founders, when they're pitching, they get asked more risk-based questions. So about the viability and the volatility of their potential business, whereas men tend to get asked a lot of growth-based questions. So where is it going? Where from now? So there seems to be a fundamental shift in how we really ask questions to the two genders. And both you and Nikhil, of course, indirectly said that you are seeing less overt resistance, but it's the more covert resistance. So I want to focus on this for 1 second. What we seem to be talking about partially, you talked about, of course, biases in decision-making, biases in selection, but there's also the issue of what we call microaggressions. So these are very subtle comments or very subtle acts that often unconsciously or unintentionally has a derogatory or harmful effect to a woman or any marginalized group. And you both raised this, that this part is now the bigger issue. So one of the questions I would like to ask you, and Pavita, I will just start with you since you have already started talking about it. When, as a leader, you see microaggressions in your immediate environment. So you're in a meeting and somebody says something that's very unintentionally really belittling maybe the work of the woman or her status in the group. What do you think that leader needs to do? How do you need to deal with this as a leader?
So I think the first issue is, can the leader actually recognize a microaggression? Because depending on the culture, which is a tone set by the leader at the top, the environment, what's the tone of the meeting? Many people say to me, many men will say to me, or many white people say to me about someone an issue raised by the minority, it's just banter. We were just joking. And women get that all the time. You need to toughen up. If you're not tough enough, you shouldn't be here, particularly in banking. And I spent a lot of time in banking. You see that quite a lot. However, it really is about respect. It's about seeing everyone. It's about being an inclusive leader. So I think if you're a leader that is focused on ensuring that all voices heard, that you recognize the skills and attributes of everyone in your team, you won't allow that to happen. I think in terms of how people deal with it, it's contextual. It depends who's in the room. It depends how it happens. But there are subtle things that can be done. So if there's a woman who is repeatedly being excluded or being spoken over, I think a very skillful leader can do that without making anybody feel uncomfortable. But these things often are not that overt. As I said, they're very subtle. So even the microaggressions can be about assumptions that managers are making in the head. And the most common one I get, we actually did some research at the 30% Club that looked at how leaders make assumptions about what roles people want next. And so we interviewed male and female line managers who had responsibility for both male and female teams. And when we did an investigation and we actually analysed, tell me where you think the next role is for person X, who was a man, and person Y, who was a woman, we recorded it and then we coded the results. And what was fascinating is that both men and women, when asked about the female individual, would say, so what job do you think this person could do next? The next question we asked is, could they do your job? In every instance, whether it was a man or female leader, they hesitated, and you can hear this on the tape, and then they'd all say, I don't think she wants to do my job. But when asked about the man, both female and male leaders would say, oh yeah, I'm sure he could do my job. And in many instances, the woman was more qualified than the man. So it's that really unconscious assumption, well, she's never shown any interest, she's never talked about it, but yeah, the guy, he could do it. And it's that sort of assumption and stretching the experience of a man to say, oh, I'm sure, yeah, Fred could do it, but she couldn't. And so these things are not always subtle. They are so overt, they're very subtle, but it can be as complex as assumptions about someone's career aspirations.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And from personal experience, I had unconscious bias training. And of course, there's a lot of questions about how effective unconscious bias training is. It brings awareness to the things you say and the acts you carry out, but does it necessarily change it? I will say one of the trainings that I received that I found much more helpful was actually what was called active bystander. And the question was, when you see these microaggressions around you, how can you step in? And sometimes you don't want to do it directly because you don't want to put the other person in an uncomfortable situation, or you don't want to be talking over them too. But there are various different mechanisms to really diffuse the situation, and in some cases actually acknowledge that there's maybe a problem here. Now, Nikhil, you'd already talked a little bit about microaggressions. Now let's get back to your role as a CEO. How can you instigate change in an organization? What do you do to instigate change in the organization? And one of the questions I find really interesting is, even for leaders that have taken very concrete steps, when they step down, the organization sometimes reverted back really quickly. So how do you make changes, and how do you make them stick? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, maybe I can answer this again from both perspectives. One as a regulator of the industry, and then one for our own organization. As regulator of the industry, there are certain areas, and you talk about microaggressions, but actually there are aggressions which are much more extreme than microaggressions. So non-financial misconduct is one area where we as a regulator, and it predates me, have set some very clear policy guidelines about how forceful we're going to be in prohibiting individuals from continuing in the financial services industry where they have been found to be responsible for non-financial misconduct. And we've made it very clear that that goes straight to the question of fitness and propriety. We have also made clear that boards of those firms that don't take these complaints and these issues seriously, that also goes to the question of their fitness and propriety. And so part of it is embedding popular policy and rule changes for us to signal that we want this culture to change. We want people to be able to speak up, and we want people to feel safe in their organizations. In terms of when I think about CEO of the FCA, tone from the top is important. Talking about these issues is important. Opening up the conversation, allowing there to be space for a debate. I think balance too. You talk about microaggressions, and sometimes women are the subject of microaggressions, but actually, sometimes it can go the other way too. I've heard of cases where a woman in a meeting has commented, "Oh, there's too many pale males here," and they need to think about, I think, what impact that has as well in the other direction, and it works both ways. Then there's straightforward performance management. This is in our objectives. It's in the objectives of my senior leadership team, and then that percolates through. Before I do my appraisal meetings with my senior leadership team, I check what the statistics are telling me and what the feedback is around these, and it's a significant part of that annual conversation. And I think that matters because if you measure something, it generally does have an impact on your day-to-day activity. So there's a few of the things we thought about. I can go on to more, but I'm sure David, or Pavita, who studied these in more detail than me, will be able to add to that.
Thank you very much. One of the questions before we continue, though, is you talked about measuring performance is really important, and something that's a lot of companies now measure performance, but sometimes the problem seems to be after what they do with those. So if there's a really serious penalty if you are underperforming. So how do you, in your organization or to essentially your impact to other organizations, how do you think holding them accountable to their performance after the performance has already been reviewed? So what steps do you take?
I'm not sure I'm completely clear on the question, but I think if I have a go, I think that one of the things that we are doing at the FCA in terms of our own performance management of our colleagues is we have a 5-box performance rating, which is not unusual in many organizations. And the top 2 boxes are the sort of highest performance, and we've said that you don't get in there unless you're demonstrating behaviour that's consistent with our values, including our commitment to diversity and inclusion. So, we're expecting everybody to demonstrate that if they want to be classified as a high performer in our organisation. When I talk about the industry more widely, one of the things we have said is that there may come a point, I'm not announcing anything new here, but there may come a point when if we don't see the data changing in a financial services institution around some of the diversity characteristics that are measured, there may come a point when we will want to take that into account in how we approve appointments or not, when roles are brought forward for succession. And we will be challenging boards very hard on their shortlists, on their processes for recruitment to explain to us why, after a number of years, some of these long-standing issues are not being addressed. In that endeavour, I don't think we're on our own. And I think, as I said, certainly for public companies, the investors are becoming much more active and demanding in this arena, as is the kind of broader social context, and that's shifted too.
Well, my question may have not been clear, but your answer was very clear, and that's exactly actually what I was asking for. Now, David, what about middle managers and colleagues? So we talked a little bit more at the leadership level, what we would expect to see, but for people in their everyday lives, in their everyday professional lives, what kind of actions seem to be particularly impactful and particularly effective in promoting gender equity?
And I thought Nikhil's response was right on the money. And Nikhil, the accountability piece I think is critical, and we're seeing this more and more of, we've got to hold obviously the senior leaders accountable for the performance and the metrics. If you're gonna try to hold now we go down to the next level, down to directors and below and to managers. If you're going to hold them accountable for this work, then you've got to hold yourself accountable first for doing this. And so I think setting that standard there. I think one of the other key pieces of this that translates from the senior levels down to the middle managers is also how we talk about the diversity and equity and inclusion in our organizations. And so we find that in many cases, for, again, white men in particular, who may be very uncomfortable talking about gender. They may be really uncomfortable talking about race or diversity or inclusion. And so they avoid it. They just don't talk about it. And it's really, if we don't have these conversations in the same way that Nikhil was talking about, then again, managers look at you and go, well, you don't talk about it, so it's obviously not important. Right? That's just an HR thing, or that's just a chief diversity officer thing, if that's something you have today. But when senior leaders do talk about it, they talk about it in a particular way that's really important. We see this make a difference. And they usually start with, they have some sort of a personal narrative, a personal connection to this, about why is this important to me personally? And it could be something about the business, it could be something about the family, their colleagues. They have a story that they tell, right? That really kind of draws people in, especially managers. And then once they've communicated that personal narrative, they always tie it back into the core business outcomes. So whatever your P&L, your major business outcomes are there, you tie it back in so that managers, because managers often look at this and go, I'm not sure what my role is here. Why should I be invested in doing this? It sounds like something, again, that HR should be doing, or the DEI team should be working on here. I'm not sure how that affects me in my day-to-day. So we have to make that connection for them, make it very clear in doing that. And the other part about this and we talked about this tangentially, is really about transparency. And transparency, both internal and external, are both important to doing this. And the internal part of this is, if you have targets, if you have goals, if you have diversity initiatives, and everybody does today, we have to be transparent about what they are. They can't be some little secret that everybody's hush hush and hiding, and we don't talk about how we're progressing. We need to be very transparent about how we're progressing and how different business units within our organizations are progressing, and that way we can begin to share best practices too. Why is one part of the organization doing better than another part of the organization? Share, again, it's not about necessarily making punitive or punishing people in some way. It's about sharing, why is one organization doing better, and how can we share those best practices in doing that. That transparency builds trust in our organization, right? So people see that and they go, oh, I hear your strategic messaging. That's great. I hear you saying all these things, but now I actually see you doing it, and I see you care, because gosh, parts of the organization aren't doing so well at this, and we're actually creating change, and we're talking about why that's not happening. And we're creating, we're talking about the kind of changes we're making to achieve that and what that looks like. The other part with middle managers in particular is, again, everybody's busy. We all have a lot on our plate, and there's not enough time in a day always to do everything and commit to everything. Is how do we get them to prioritize this? One of the ways you can do this is by looking at very specific everyday practices that they have ownership of, that they control these practices. Might be a policy, but it's usually an everyday practice or a process they have within their organization where we know that bias probably exists in some way. And if we can, again, work with them to understand how bias exists and how can we change the everyday practice so that it can be more equitable for everyone, and we can actually show where we actually achieve results, these small wins add up. They produce confidence in these managers, and these managers begin to go, oh, okay, well, I can do that. Now I can do this over here. And they see ways to apply these same kind of procedures in different places that they have cognizance over. And so I think that's really important. And of course, the final piece of that is, how do you hold them accountable? And in the same way, I think you're holding senior leaders accountable for doing this work. You've got to hold them. This is part of their performance metrics. They've got to be held accountable for it. Again, not about punishing people, not about blaming and shaming people. This is about holding people accountable for doing the work that we expect them to do each time.
Thank you very much. My last question is essentially almost a two-part question, because I'm interested in quite specific examples about how we can, one, proactively advocate women. So this could be, what do you think are the most important practices? It could be around maternity, paternity leaves. It could be allowing promotion while working part-time, processes for returning to work, or just sponsorship, mentorship opportunities. And the second part is to drive cultural change more broadly. So lobbying across the sector, changes across part-time caring responsibilities, so societal level changes rather than organizational level changes. So given, you can choose whichever level you would like, but what do you think are the most important practices? May I start with Pavita?
So, I mean, I think these are some of the most critical things that's going to unlock progression for women. So when you look at things like parental leave, it has become the latest in vogue thing for companies to take on board, which is great. John Lewis Partnership have just announced it, but less than 2% of men take up that shared parental leave. And we know that the early experience when a child is young of bonding with both parents is really critical. So if the assumption in most systems around the world of work are that it's a woman that takes on that primary caring role, that never ever goes. And so I'll give you an example. My husband and I both work. If one of our children is sick, the school constantly only ever ring me, and I have told them till I'm blue in the face that there is a nanny, that there is my husband, there is me, and it doesn't matter if I could be in Hong Kong, they still ring me. They can't get their head around the fact that there could be somebody else that might be available to take that call. So we have to sort of break this the way people think about the primary caring role. That's really important. But other simple symbols. So for example, when women are on maternity leave, the notion of having them in the discussion around talent and succession is important. So promoting somebody while they're actually out of the workplace is really important. Looking really in innovative ways, looking at agile working, as we could call it now, or part-time working. There are so many institutions I work with that for whatever reason, for reasons of national security or whatever else, said we will never, ever, ever have our colleagues working from home. They've all moved to a model where, worst case scenario, 80% of people working from home. So isn't it interesting how a crisis has driven organizations to challenge their own assumptions about where work can actually happen? So that's really important. And I think more broadly also the motherhood penalty, so the issue of the fact that some managers and leaders will assume that once a woman has one child, that's really difficult. Once she has two, that's a critical point at which she'll drop off. But we know that women tell us that when they leave, they don't leave the organization, they leave the manager. So if they're able to create or construct a role which allows them to work in a way that's conducive with supporting all the other responsibilities in their life, they're more likely to stay, and they're less likely to even be attracted by more money or anything else, because they will not give up that protected terms that they've negotiated. But the other thing we know is that for the next demographic coming through, millennials and beyond, it's not just women. Young men will say, I don't want to be the person my father was. I don't want to be an absent father. I want to be totally engaged. And frankly, this is not a debate about having children. There are plenty of women who are struggling to get on, even with no kids. But young people sort of saying, I want my work life over the next 40, 50 years to be a series of assignments where I dip in and I dip out and I do interesting things, and maybe I take a sabbatical and then I come back. So we are all being faced with a changing face of the world of work, and we have to adapt. And so the organizations that don't will lose the best talent, and it's not just women.
You brought up excellent points, and we see this among our students too. The younger generation among our students, they seem to say they would like to take gap years, and it has nothing to do with family commitments. It's usually around they want to pursue some entrepreneurial activities, or they want to invest some time in activities for societal good. So you're absolutely right. There is a new generation that comes up where some of these questions now seem to be asked across genders. Nikhil, what about you? What do you think?
Well, Pavita's given a really impressive summary of some of the big issues. So I would focus on 2 points. One, mentorship and the ability to have role models, and build a professional network where you can draw on advice and support. And secondly, the flexible working opportunities are important. We've learned a huge amount during the pandemic about precisely what is possible. Many organizations, for understandable reasons, are also, including our own, looking at a phased return to the office for a certain percentage of time. And I think one of the things we're going to have to be very vigilant about as that recovery from the pandemic and partial return to the office takes place is that we don't create a culture where those who come back to the office 100% of the time because they don't have caring responsibilities or other responsibilities at home are somehow preferenced in career progression, allocation of work, and so on. So I think that vigilance on an ongoing basis will also be pretty important.
Yes, a very good point. One of the questions that really seems to have come out of this year and about agile working and how do we allow similar or the same opportunities for people who choose different working patterns. What about you, David?
And I think we heard some of the key points here, in particular with Pavita talking about all the issues around kind of the work-life interaction there in particular, and all the advances that women have made in the workplace over the last 6 decades really came up through really the turn of the century, and it's kind of stalled out since then. And a large part of that's because women have done basically everything they can do to adapt to the workplace, the men's workplace, but men have done nothing to really. There's been very little change in terms of men going and changing how they approach caregiving, how they approach the domestic responsibilities. And so this has got to be part of it as well. And so I think we've heard different aspects of that about how do we, again, make it, it's not stigmatizing for men to be taking their parental leave. It's not stigmatizing for men. It's normalizing it for men to be part of the caregiving responsibilities on a day-to-day basis, so that Pavita's not always getting the call when she's not the she-fault, as we call it, right? When the school calls or the doctor calls or somebody calls that's related to the kids, it's why don't I get the phone call first? And those kinds of things are happening. So we've got to begin to normalize caregiving for all parents, right? For all people, right? We all have a variety of different kind of caregiving responsibilities, and not just look at women as being the default there. The other one I think is really important that Nikhil touched on, and the advocacy piece. And this gets at the idea that why we find less representation of women in the senior ranks. We have a pay equity gap. We have occupational sex segregation still going on. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that in many ways, men are not advocating for women or people who don't look like them. And we've got to begin to hold them responsible for the sponsorship, for doing the advocacy as part of mentoring, of doing the everyday advocacy and the sharing of information and opportunities and pushing people forward that don't look like me. And beginning to acknowledge that, hey, you can't just push people who are in your network forward. We've got to look around at the broader talent base that we have in our organizations and be held accountable for doing that kind of work too.
I would like to thank all of you for this great conversation and for all the wisdom you really shared with us. We really talked about leaders and people in their everyday professional lives, how they can be involved in this conversation. We talked about the importance of processes and public policy also.